Here's a question. There are over 500,000 plant species on the planet, of which we have used 30,000 as food and grown around 7,000 as crops throughout human history. How many do you think we now depend on for most of our food? 5,000? 3,000? 1,000 crops? 4. Only 4 crops, wheat, rice, maize and soya, now provide over 60% of the calories in the human diet. The other 7,000 are ignored, neglected or underutilized. They are forgotten crops. Here's another question. Of over 30,000 spoken languages, of which 7,000 are still living, that means still spoken today, how many do you think most of us now speak? 4. 4 written languages: English, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and Hindi Urdu are spoken by over half of humanity. The other 7,000 are marginalized, stigmatized, or ignored. They are forgotten languages. So we now depend on just 4 crops, mostly grown as industrial monocultures for our food, and just 4 languages for written knowledge of how to grow, store, process, cook, market, and trade them. The result is that our globalized food system depends on products from a handful of staple crops grown far from where they're consumed and transported along carbon-heavy and vulnerable supply chains to consumers around the world. Whether we live in London or Lagos, Caracas or Karachi, we increasingly eat the same foods using the same ingredients derived from a narrow range of staple crops. Over 25% of our food is wasted before it ever reaches our plates. Not only is our food system risky, it is increasingly unhealthy. Our reliance on a monotonous diet that is rich in calories, low in nutrients, means that there are now more obese than undernourished people on the planet. It means that otherwise well-fed people suffer from the phenomenon of hidden hunger because their diet is deficient in micronutrients. And even more alarmingly, it means that around 20% of children under the age of 5 are stunted because of their poor diets. Now, stunting is irreversible. Stunted children grow up to be stunted adults. A globalized food system brings with it huge risks, which are only going to increase in the challenges facing humanity and the planet. While the COVID pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of the global food system, what we are less aware of is the link between poor diets and COVID infection. Diet-related diseases such as obesity, diabetes and hypertension are leading comorbidity factors associated with COVID. Now, almost all of us recognize that the climate crisis is no longer somewhere far away and in the distant future, but it is here and now. What we are less aware of is that the food system and its allied industries are now responsible for 25% of carbon emissions, and that agriculture uses 75% of the world's fresh water. Without transforming the food system, we have no chance of meeting the Paris target of limiting increases in temperature to within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. In fact, current predictions are an increase in global temperatures of closer to 3 degrees Celsius. This means that our narrow range of elite staple crops will have to grow in hotter, drier conditions to which they are ill-suited and poorly adapted. Whilst there may be a vaccine for COVID, there is no vaccine for the climate crisis. On the 15th of April 1912, the ocean liner the Titanic sank after it hit an iceberg while travelling at full speed. Despite the warnings of his lookouts, Captain Edward Smith insisted on continuing on the same path, saying that a mere iceberg couldn't stop a ship as magnificent as the Titanic from reaching its destination on time. As a result, over 1,500 passengers perished. While passengers in first-class cabins made it to the lifeboats, those in the lower decks drowned, many because they were prevented by the ship's guards from reaching the upper deck. Now, we can think of ourselves as passengers on the Titanic food system. The lookouts are our scientists and young people. The captain represents our political and industry leaders. And the passengers are us, the consumers. Unless we make the captain change course or take control of the ship, the Titanic food system will hit the iceberg of the climate crisis. To avoid hitting the climate iceberg, we must change the direction of the titanic food system. But how? A good place to start is to diversify our food system with those forgotten crops and the forgotten languages and knowledge stored in them that have sustained us throughout history. Rediscovering forgotten foods is more than just looking for their recipes. It means identifying the climate resilient and nutritious crops from which they derive, the cultures associated with them, and diverse and climate resilient management systems that go beyond the industrial monoculture of a few staple crops in a few exporting countries. Earlier this year, the Global Forum for Agricultural Research and Innovation, GFAR, launched the Global Manifesto for Forgotten Foods. Its purpose is to deliver a global plan of action that diversifies food production systems to ensure more affordable, accessible, and nutritious food, greater resilience and better adaptation of agriculture to climate change, new income opportunities for the poor, and collective actions to diversify food systems with forgotten crops. This means linking the cultures and expertise of those marginalized communities that have protected these crops for millennia with scientific knowledge, new technologies, and novel production systems. It also means building intergenerational links between rural communities and urban dwellers, especially young people, to provide a new generation of farmers and a new model of agriculture. As well as rediscovering forgotten crops, the Manifesto for Forgotten Foods calls for an overhaul of the research, innovation, and policy frameworks that underpin the global food system. This means seeing marginalized communities and their crops not as recipients of aid or beneficiaries of new technologies, but as co-innovators and as partners. When it comes to living and farming in hostile environments, it is they, not us, who are the experts. If we are unwilling to change the existing business as usual globalized food system, we must be absolutely certain that 4 crops, 4 languages, and 1 globalized food system will not just feed 7.8 billion people, but nourish 10 billion people, not in a 1.5 degrees Celsius hotter world, but in a 3 degrees Celsius hotter world. It will not. If humanity is to meet the challenge of the climate crisis and future pandemics, we must transform food systems for good. That is both for the long term and for the good of humanity and the planet. If we want to know where we want to go, we need to know where we have come from. In the transformation of the food system for good, forgotten foods and the knowledge associated with them can feed the future.